Hello, my name is Chris, and I'm going to be doing a little. This is just a trial run, basically, of a series that I had thought about just through prayer and like late night. Just the thought that came to me of something called Just Thoughts, where currently I'm reading a Bible plan called As It Happened, and I'm going through the Bible chronologically, starting from Genesis and going to the different books of the Bible as it would have happened in a timeline, not necessarily how it's put together in the Bible right now. And so today's chapters I had read were Exodus 1 through 3. And this is basically the beginning of Moses. This is talking about setting the stage of the oppression of the Israelites after Joseph dies and Jacob dies. And Moses, killing an Egyptian, running to Midian, and meeting God in the burning bush. Chapters 1, 2, and 3. And so there was just a couple of things, a couple of thoughts, which is why I'm calling it Just Thoughts, that I picked up on when reading. And it was really interesting. In Exodus chapter 1, verse 12, what's basically happening in Exodus chapter 1 is after Joseph dies, all the favor that God had poured out on this man, in terms of the Pharaoh and all of Egypt preparing for the famine and all the years of blessings that he brought about in his service, they're all forgotten about. It tells us flat out in verse 8. Then a new king to whom Joseph meant nothing came to power in Egypt. So the entire series of events that occurred while Joseph was in Egypt has been forgotten by this one king. And so the king looks around and sees all these Hebrews, all the Israelites, and wonders, not wonders, but is threatened. He sees that they are more numerous against the Egyptians, and if war breaks out, they will join the enemies of Egypt, and so he decides to put them under harsh rule. He puts them in forced labor. And I'm looking in my study Bible, and the word for labor in Hebrew is avodah. And it can mean work, slavery, oppression, or even worship. And I think it's just very cool that as we see throughout the Bible in different dark circumstances, in these darkness, light can persist through worship. And it's very cool that the very same word that can mean labor or work or slavery can mean worship. And so there was just one verse in particular that really stuck out to me in Exodus chapter 1. And that was when it says, verse 12, "But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly." So I think that's very, very interesting, because if you look at Christianity, and it just shows you that the God of the Old Testament is the same God of the New, in that whenever persecution is its strongest, that's when the church starts to grow. It's like a popular saying in Christian circles, but it's very true. Whenever there's persecution, you'll notice that a lot of people cling to God more so than in comfort. And I think the devil uses comfort to really let down our guard and allow him to have a foothold, and go up against him, and make us weak to go up against him. And so, that was Exodus chapter 1. And so it sets the stage for Moses. Obviously, Pharaoh gives the decree that to snuff out essentially the Hebrews by ordering that the midwives kill the sons, and the midwives say no, essentially. They rebel. They make up an excuse saying that Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They are vigorous and give birth before midwives arrive. And all this to say that Pharaoh was after the Hebrew children, and it just really sets up the story and sets up the cause or the rationale behind the swift and powerful signs, I guess, that God uses in the form of the 10 plagues against the people of Egypt. Talking about how hard the slave drivers are driving the Hebrews, and how corrupt and how evil Pharaoh was being in killing off the children of the Israelites. So anyway, to move on with the story, obviously, a man from the tribe of Levi. Moses is a Levite, and it's just very cool to see later on in the story about how Levi is the chosen tribe that's supposed to be the priestly tribe, and it's very cool that the very first influential leader in the book of Exodus is from the tribe of Levi. And that kind of sets up the story for us, because though the law was given through Moses and Jesus fulfilled the law, it came from priests, and we are called to be a priestly generation. If we're followers of Christ who fulfilled the law that came from Moses, a priest, then in doing so, we are part of this royal priesthood that the Bible talks about. And so anyway, the coolest part I find in this chapter specifically is the name Moses. The name Moses that Pharaoh's daughter gives to the baby that she finds in the basket. She calls him Moses, which means to draw out, because what she says, I drew him out of the water. Now, Pharaoh's daughter obviously couldn't know the eternal ramifications of naming this boy Moses, because it just shows that even though people who may not know God, you got to remember the daughter of Pharaoh was the daughter of Pharaoh. It never says here that she worshipped the God of Israel. It never said that she worshipped the God of the Hebrews. So if we're going based off of that, she probably, and again, this is just my opinion. This is why I'm calling it Just Thoughts. I didn't research this online because I kind of wanted a candid sort of first impressions when reading the Bible. So anyway, if Pharaoh's daughter is a part of this Egyptian culture, she probably worshipped many other gods. It says that they built Ramses and Pithom as store cities for Pharaoh, that named after the greats of Egypt, and as you know, Egypt's history is a polytheistic society. So she obviously didn't know what was going to happen. She wasn't a prophet of God to know that in naming this boy that she found in the river, Moses, that his entire life would mirror that calling of drawing out. He drew out the Egyptians, the Israelites from Egypt. He was on Mount Sinai and drew out, so to speak, wrote down that the laws and commandments that God was giving him. So it's just a very, very cool thing, and it says for us that even though we may not be, there may be people that aren't even associated with God, may not have heard, because at this point, God doesn't have the name I am yet. Well, I mean, he does, but Moses didn't come back and say, tell them that I am sent me, So she didn't know God. She didn't know the eternal ramifications of what she was doing, that Moses would be this great leader, and it just shows this in the next section where it talks about Moses fleeing to Midian. This hardly looks like a leader, and this is exactly the kind of people that God uses throughout the entire Bible. They showed this and even in the earlier patriarchs with Jacob. He was the deceiver, and he was deceived, rightly so. He deceives Esau into selling his birthright. He deceives Esau into getting Esau's blessing. He deceives Isaac by getting Esau's blessing. And so, in return, he's known as the deceiver. Jacob literally means he who deceives. And God takes the deceiver and puts him through whatever trials so that way he can overcome it and to turn himself into Israel. And he becomes this great leader and the father of many nations, just like the covenant with Abraham foretold, So anyway, that's just a long way of saying that God chose Moses, who went on to kill an Egyptian. And it's just very cool because it just shows you that God has greater plans than anything that man can come up with. Moses did what was right in his own eyes by killing an Egyptian, beating a Hebrew. And so the next day, when he sees two Hebrews fighting and hitting each other, he asks them the question instead of immediately rushing to the aid of one or the other. Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew? The man said, who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you have killed the Egyptian? Then Moses was afraid and thought, what I did must have become known. When Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian, where he sat down by a well. And in this time of fear, of fleeing from persecution, from an attack, after he committed objectively a sin. There was no calling from God to kill a man. And you're not going to find that really in any part of the Bible where it says, go and kill this man. Revenge is the Lord's. And he displays this with the promise that comes in Exodus chapter 3. So, long story short, he goes to Midian, and he gets married, and he bears a son, or his wife bears a son. And so he's there for a long period, and during this time, the slavery and the oppression just becomes so great that there's this great outcry to God. And Moses phrases it like this: God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them. And so now, it's not that God didn't know that this was going on. God obviously did. But this is now where God is written into the story clearly by the author of Exodus, Moses. And so we need a hero. We need a deliverer. There's in the book of the Bible, there's all these great men and women who are these deliverers of the nation of Israel at a specific time. And it just follows that route until you get the ultimate deliverer, which comes in the form of Jesus, who can track his lineage down to Noah. And so it's just cool seeing these early chapters and seeing how, if you keep on reading through the Bible, you can see the life and the personhood of Jesus, taking certain aspects from all the different judges and leaders and priests over the course of Israel's history. So anyway, in Exodus chapter 3, with Moses in the burning bush, the craziest thing ever happening, Israel needs a hero, and this hero comes in the form of Moses, a convicted murderer, fleeing, a fugitive of Pharaoh, and he waits until that Pharaoh dies, I believe so. I could be wrong. Again, these are just my thoughts. But yes. And so this, Moses to me is a great, I can identify with Moses a lot. Moses is anyway, he has this experience with God, and he sees an angel of the Lord there's an angel of the Lord in the burning bush, and he goes to examine it. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. When the Lord saw that he had gone over, he said, Moses, Moses, and Moses said, here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. He knows the God of his ancestors. He knows the reverence that you need to have with the God of your ancestors. How amazing is that? He grew up in the household of the Egyptians, yet he knew his people and he knew his God. Their God. That's amazing to me. I feel like there's little gaps or little spaces to me where I don't know all the bits of the story, but it's just very interesting to see from Moses' perspective. And so Moses said to God, this is the part that I really identify with, where he says, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? I apologize. And God said, and this is the key part, I will be with you, and this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. Now, that is an incredible sign, but it does not come to completion until many years after this event. Moses largely has to go based off of faith, and he rightly says, "Who am I? Who am I? You know, I'm a speck of dust, and your breath is in my nostrils. You know, who am I that I should go and do this amazing event?" And Moses comes up with all the different excuses. Suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, "The God of your fathers has sent me to you." They will ask me, "What is his name?" Then what shall I tell them? But God, in this moment, God provides something that only God can, and that's earnest peace, earnest hope, earnest comfort. God is the God of all comfort, true comfort, not in comfort in pleasures and comfort in leisure or anything like that, but true comfort, true security is really what God brings. And so, if you see a burning bush, you're obviously going to be like, whoa, this is important. The bush is not burning up yet; it's all on fire. It's a miraculous event. So obviously, God has great power. But at the same time, that's a lot to go on. That's a lot to go off of. God also said to Moses, "Say to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, the name you shall call me from generation to generation." I think that parallels even with Jesus' name, you know. But anyway, it's just very, 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 very cool to use that word, but very reassuring that God will send you on these paths. Now, maybe you might not have specifically an audible voice from you, but there are different little events that we may not understand in the moment, but it's really God's way of reaching out to us. There are probably burning bushes in our lives that are probably quite as obvious, but we are overlooking. To where God has a big promise for each and every one of us. There's a reason why every person that watches this video, or every person who doesn't watch this video, I don't really care, but God loves them. I love you guys, and God has a plan for all of them, all of us. And God had a plan for Moses, and Moses' plan, he came from an area of complete destruction. He was an orphan, essentially, adopted by parents that weren't his own. He never knew his original parents. He grew up in an Egyptian culture that was not praising of God. In fact, it subjugated the very people who brought the God of Israel to them, the news of the God of Israel, I'm assuming. I could be wrong. And so he grows up in this area, and it says later on, that how can I talk to them? He stumbles a lot with his words, as I do, and so that's another way that I connect with him. And yet God takes all the weaknesses and turns them into something great. It's like what Paul says, that we boast in our sufferings and our weaknesses. That's the only place that we're going to boast, and in the confidence that we have in Jesus Christ. But anyway, it's just very, very interesting and very reassuring that God has a plan for all of us, no matter what we've done, no matter who we've wronged, how we've tried to make up for it. God still has a plan for us, and it's not just because of who our Father is on earth, but it's because of our Father in heaven, whose great mercy. This isn't. I think it's Micah or Malachi that says that God rejoices in compassion, mercy, and righteousness. And God has great compassion, great mercy, and great righteousness. How can you find a fault within God? And yet he uses the faulty to serve a faultless aim. And I don't know, if that's not good news, then I don't know what is. So thank you guys for listening, and God bless.